How are you doing? My name is Johnson from Group 279. I'll be explaining how the Japanese used the Southern prison, what it is, and how unique what the structure of the building was. To understand the Korean activists' spirits of independence, we first have to know how terrible the Japanese used the Southern prison. What actually is the Southern prison? Since the Japanese follow Western-style culture, they also wanted to have one colony of themselves, as all the other Western countries did. The Japanese constructed Gyeongsang Prison in 1910, becoming the prototype of the Southern prison. It contains 보안과 청사, 중앙사, 공작사, 사형장, 여옥사, and many other buildings as its structure grew. These buildings will be informed to you later on. This time, we will be more focused on the Korean activists. The Southern prison's ordinary purpose was to arrest all the Korean rebels in order to compress and threaten the spirits of Korean activists who shouted for their country's independence. The Southern prison contained a lot of buildings, including 중앙사 and 여옥사, which made those great rebellions vulnerable. Our group will specifically introduce 여옥사, and it was used to torture Korean women activists. This included Yu Gan-sun, as well known as the organizer of the March 1st movement, and every other well-known Korean activists such as Yeoni, Shin Kwan-bin, Do Sung-kyung, Im Young-hae, and Kim Hyung-ha. If you have an interest in Korean history, I've got to say, you will find a familiar name, Yu Gan-sun. Even if she was in prison, she didn't lose her composure and cheered for Korea's independence. However, after all the tortures the Japanese used at Yu Gan-sun, she died without watching Korea's independence with her own eye. That's why we also call this place Yu Gan-sun-gul. They were imprisoned in a tiny room that barely fit 10 people, so they had to move around on a circle. When you talk about the Southern prison, the first thing people will came up with will be torture. Nowadays, tortures have been stopped from economical reasons, but the Japanese did not hesitate to use them. They used a lot of types of tortures, which also frightened the Korean activists. They asked questions about important information against Korean activists. If the rebels do not tell them, they start to torture the activists. After all, the Japanese began to invade the country. They successfully defeated the Qing dynasty and Russia, and then they earned all those necessary resources to invade Korea. In the beginning, the building was much smaller than what it is now. As the number of Korean activists increased, the Japanese decided to structure a greater building. Specific location the Japanese placed the Southern prison was in front of the Korean Independence Gate in order to compress the determination of our ancestors. However, as we all know, the spirits of our ancestors were greater than what the Japanese expected. This was a simple step for me to express what happened before our mighty ancestors showed up and what the starting point of the Korean independence. From now on, Kim Tae-yeon will be explaining the actions of the Korean women activists took. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Selena. Today I'm at the Seodaemun prison. My presentation topic is about women. You may guess she's going to talk about women in prison. Actually, I'm going to talk about women who participated in the independence movement. There are two types. Firstly, I want to introduce women who sacrificed themselves for our independence. For instance, there are Yu Gan-sun, Nam Ja-hyun, Yoon Hee-sun, An Kyung-shin, Lee Hwa-rim, and Kim Ma-ria. They participated in the action to kill Japanese soldiers, but sadly, most of the times it failed. During this mission, lots of patriots were killed or sent to the prison. While they were in prison, there was a national independence movement on March 1st. So people who weren't caught made a Korean flag called taegukgi and distributed them with each other. On March 1st, national independence movement was held everywhere. People marched holding Korean flag. It also happened in the prison, which was led by Yu Gan-sun. They also joined the Korean Patriots Hanin Egokdan. Moon Il-sung was the first woman who became a general of armies. An Gyeong-shin threw a bomb at the police station while she was pregnant for 7 months, and because of her actions, she was executed. Secondly, there were women who took part of the independence movement secretly, because at the time, women weren't supposed to lead independence movement like men, so they had to act confidentially. So they helped in the hospital and take care of the patients. For example, there are Jo Maria, Lee Do-shin, and Park Jae. Jo Maria, who is known as Kim Goo's mother, donated lots of money. Park Jae made an independent movement club, which is Nurses Club. They helped patients who were hurt and run the hospital. They worked hard for our Korean independence in different places and in different ways, but it doesn't matter. What we have to think is that they all tried their best to make our Korea independent. We must think who sacrificed themselves to give us our country, our identity, our freedom to define us as a Korean, and we have to thank them.
During the Japanese colonial period, many women also participated in the independence movement, and I will talk about 2 female independence fighters. First, I will talk about Nam Ja-hyun, who was called the mother of the independence army. And she visited militaries which were conducting the independence movement and established churches in 12 places in East Manchuria. And she also planned to assassinate Taito, the Japanese governor general, but failed. In 1932, when the Litton investigation team came to Harbin, she wrote in her blood Korea Independence Center in a white towel and sent it to the team. Unfortunately, she was caught by Japanese police and she could be released 6 months later. As a woman, she contributed greatly to independence movement. That's why she is called the mother of military armies. The second person I want to talk about is Kim Maria. She organized the Women Anti-Japanese Movement Group, and she was a representative of a women patriotic association. She dedicated her whole life to independence movement, and she participated in the February 8th declaration and served as a member of the province government of Republic of Korea. When she was old, she taught students and collected military funds and delivered them to the province government. Thank you.
The most famous female freedom fighter that every Korean knows is Yu Kwan-sun. Yu Kwan-sun was an organizer in what would come to be known as the March 1st movement against Imperial Japanese colonial rule of Korea in South Changcheong. The March 1st movement was considered a peaceful demonstration by the Korean people against Japanese rule. Yu Kwan-sun was born on December 16, 1902, near Cheonan in the South Changcheong province of Korea. She was considered an intelligent child and would memorize Bible passages upon hearing them only once. She attended Ihwa School, today known as Ihwa Women's University, through a scholarship program that requires recipients to work as a teacher after graduation. At the time, few Korean women attended university in 1990, while she was a student at the Ihwa Girls High School. She witnessed the beginnings of the March 1st movement. She, along with a 5-person group, took a part in the movement and participated in demonstration in Seoul. On March 10, 1990, all of the schools, including the Ihwa Women's School, were temporarily closed by the Governor General of Korea. She returned home to Cheonan. The Japanese military police offered Ryu a lighter sentence in exchange of her admission of guilt and her cooperation in finding other protest collaborators. However, she refused to reveal the identity of any of her collaborators, even after being severely tortured. After Ryu's arrest, she was initially detained at the Cheonan Japanese military office station, then transferred to the Gongju police station prison. At her trial, She argued with the proceedings were controlled by the Japanese colonial administration, the law of Governor General of Korea, and was overseen by the assigned Japanese judge. Despite her attempts to obtain what she believed was a fair trial, she received a guilty verdict on counts of sedition and security law violation and was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment at Seodaemun prison. During her imprisonment, Ryu continued to support the Korean independence movement, which resulted in her being severely punished and tortured by the Japanese prison officers. On March 1, 1920, Ryu prepared a large-scale protest with her fellow inmates in honor of the first anniversary of the March 1st independence movement. Ryu was imprisoned separately in an isolated cell. She died on September 28, 1920 from injuries she sustained from the torture and beatings inflicted by the Japanese prison officers. Japan will fail, she wrote while in the prison. Even if my fingernails are torn out, my nose and ears are ripped apart, and my legs and arms are crushed, the physical pain does not compare to the pain of losing my nation. My only remorse is not being able to do more than dedicating my life to my country.
This was the place where the female independence fighters were put, and it is called Yoksa. It was built in 1910 and was removed in 1979, but was rebuilt in 2011, and now the artifacts related to the women's independence and anti-Japanese movement are placed here. The female prisoners whose sentences weren't given yet were the people who were put here. The women activists who protested against the Japanese went through all kinds of tortures under the name of investigation in this place. The most famous cell is in prison number 8. Prison number 8 was the place where many female leading protesters, including Yu Gon-sun, were put. On March 1st, 1920, on the first anniversary of March 1st movement, they continued to struggle for independence by doing things such as shouting out for independence in their prison cells. There is a song called The Song of Prison Number 8, which was sung by them during their time of prison. The building was constructed with a structure that had a corridor in the middle and had 5 to 6 rooms on each side. If you look into the room, you can see that it is very small and seems like 2 to 3 people can fit in it, but actually 7 to 8 people were cramped in there together. And the prison rooms for the female freedom fighters were much smaller and had fewer rooms, which means that each room was crowded and was in a poor condition to stay in. Oh, I can't leave out Yu Gon-sun's underground prison. In 1992, during the construction of the National Independence Park, 4 underground prisons were found. It was surprising, and when it was recovered, it was revealed that this was where Yu Gon-sun had died.
After the movement of independence at March 1st, 1919, many freedom fighters had came inside this prison. After about 1 year later, at 1920, another movement of independence has started inside of this prison, and this is the room where it started first. There were all 8 people inside this room, and there were various kind of people. There were students, a person who can see, Korean geisha, kindergarten teacher, and so on. And they're all in the middle of the independence during prison. But there was a problem. They're not allowed to talk to each other about the independence and the things related to it inside this prison. So how did they give signs to each other when they're not allowed to talk about it? The answer is by knocking on to each wall. They had divided the consonant and the vowel by the sound of the knocking. For example, the vowel was knocked more softly like this, and the consonant was knocked more hardly like this. By using this method, they had made a plan to make an independence movement at March 1st, 1920. As soon as the independence movement had started, people from this prison had shouted for their independence and their country. They all knew that they will have torture after this, but they had fought hard for their country and their independence. Like this, our heroes deserved to be remembered. But many female independence fighters are not remembered as the male independence fighters. I believe that they are deserved to be remembered as well as the male fighters. Female independence fighters had fought hard for their country and their independence. They had sacrificed themselves for it. But in today, many people just remember Yugansun or the other male independence fighters. And we hope that you can remember many other female independence fighters who had sacrificed themselves after watching this video. We appreciate that you had watched this video, and thank you